Hello everyone, how are you doing? I hope you all had a good holiday. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different for the channel. We're going to be doing a review video. And this isn't sponsored or anything, I just thought I would review the PowerA Wireless Gamecube Controller because Smash Bros. Released recently, and I've been talking to a lot of friends who have picked up the game over the holidays, and they absolutely despise playing it with the Joy-Cons. And they're debating whether or not they should get a Pro Controller. And a Pro Controller is a fine way to play Smash Bros., but I think that the PowerA controller, especially for Melee veterans, might be one of the better choices you can get. So in this video we're going to be talking about its features, how it compares to a original real GameCube controller, and why you might want to use this over a Pro Controller, or why you might want to go with a Pro Controller over this. There are positives and negatives, but I think overall, calling it a little bit early, but I think that this might be my favorite controller that I currently own. So before we get into that, let's talk about the features of it and what it actually is. Now, the case is a little bit deceptive. This isn't so much as another GameCube controller, rather this is more of a Pro Controller in a GameCube shell. And that means it's got all the same features as a Switch Pro Controller, but it also means that it's missing a couple features that the GameCube controller originally had. For example, the biggest and most noticeable difference is the triggers on the back of this controller. With the original GameCube controller, these are pressure sensitive and they can click in. So they have quite a few functions. Say you're playing a racing game, you can control your speed, and clicking it in could be some kind of drift or brake or something like that. With the PowerA controller, this travel time is just for show. These are just buttons. They're either on or off. However, the travel time, which you might have already noticed, is significantly less than the travel time on the GameCube controller before it's pushed all the way in. So for Smash Bros., that's actually a plus. It's a lot easier to shield a lot quicker with this thing than to try and do that on the original GameCube controller. But, of course, the Switch Pro Controller is going to be the fastest. Let's talk about some of the other features that it shares with the Pro Controller. So, obviously it has a select screen capture and home button in addition to the start button the original GameCube had. One of the strangest feeling things ever, because in your hands this feels like a GameCube controller, is that these analog sticks can, in fact, click down as additional buttons just like the Switch controller. And that's very bizarre, because I've grown up with the GameCube controller for years and they don't do that. Now, because of that, you'd expect that these analog sticks would feel drastically different and maybe even worse quality than the original. As far as the feedback is concerned, they feel pretty much identical, giving the original one the benefit of the doubt in that this one is an original GameCube controller and it doesn't feel quite as springy, probably because it's just worn out over time. But this one feels like it springs back into action a lot better than this one does. As for the material where your thumb actually goes, it's kind of soft and squishy on the original one, whereas this one it's a little more rigid and hard, but they both grip just as well. I've never had my thumb slip off of either of these controllers. Now, they also added an extra Z button, which works as L and R in this case, whereas the original one, of course, only had one, but, you know, it's made up for the fact that these have so many functions to them. And whereas the travel time is a lot better on the triggers, with the PowerA controller, for the Z button, or L and R if you want to call them, it's actually kind of worse. Not bad, it's not going to cause you to die or anything, but the speed you can press this at is not quite comparable to the original GameCube controller. Like, there's practically no travel time at all in this thing. Though I do have to mention, in my time of playing GameCube, I do accidentally press this all the time when I'm quickly going for the big trigger on the bottom. My finger will slip and I'll press it and it'll activate, whereas this one, that's not really a problem. So call that a plus or a negative, it really depends on the game and, you know, how good you are at not hitting the wrong button. They also stick out quite a bit further, so you'll actually be more aware of where it actually is, instead of this thing just hiding behind the corner. So compared to a GameCube controller, so the first thing you'll notice when you take this out of the box compared to an original GameCube controller is that it weighs significantly less. But once you put the batteries into the battery pack on the back, it weighs almost the same amount. In fact, it's very slightly heavier than the GameCube controller, but it will feel the same considering this one's wireless and this one's got a wire tugging on it. They'll feel almost identical. If anything, this feels a little bit heavier just because of the wire attached. And this is why it's really more of a Pro controller than a GameCube controller. It's got all the Pro controller's features, including wireless. You can't actually plug this in at all. You'll notice there's no port for that. So it's either wireless or nothing because there's no connection for it. I think it would have been cool if they included a wired connection and maybe it could actually charge the thing, but that's probably asking too much for its $50 price tag. Now, because it has the battery pack inside the controller and out of the way, it's missing a key feature. This controller does not have rumble. That's actually a pretty big downgrade from the original GameCube controller, which had a great feeling rumble. But as far as I'm concerned, I never really cared too much about rumble anyway, and hey, I'll sacrifice rumble to keep the battery pack from sticking out and cramping your fingers like it did on the original wireless Xbox 360 controller. Little mini rant here, I don't understand why they did this. This feels awful. Now, while it may be missing rumble, it does have something that the GameCube controller could only dream about having, and that is, this thing actually has gyroscopic controls and works with pretty much any Switch game. In fact, any Switch game that uses a Pro controller, this will run no problem. I mean, there's literally nothing missing from the Pro controller to this, aside from an amiibo reader. But if that's it, that's not really that much of a problem. Now, for a veteran GameCube player like myself, and many watching this may be, when you first hold the PowerA controller, you'll notice it doesn't feel quite the same. Like, the texture's the same, and it's the same basic shape, but something about the plastic just doesn't feel GameCube. I think this plastic, I don't want to say it feels stronger, but it definitely feels different than the PowerA controller, and that's probably to be expected. I mean, you can't expect the same plastic to be used in the PowerA controller as they used in the GameCube all those years ago. I think it's pretty similar, especially the texture of the plastic. That kind of like, it's almost smooth, but there's a little bit of roughness for grip. That's present on both of these controllers, except for my grips on this one because that has worn away over the years.
Inserting this random side note that I forgot to mention earlier, don't worry about stressing your controller by button mashing or playing Smash Bros. Competitively. I've been using this controller non-stop for Smash Bros. Since the game launched, and it's showing no signs of wear at all so far. It feels like it's very good build quality, just like the original controller.
Now, call me crazy, but when I hold this thing, it almost feels like the grips are about 3 millimeters in, more inward facing on both sides. Like they don't seem to stick out as far. You can put these on top of each other and almost see that they stick out a little bit further on the GameCube controller. So if you're literally just playing GameCube and you immediately want to play Switch and grab this, you might have to adjust your hand a little bit. Like, it feels just a little bit off. I might be crazy on this. Maybe it's just the texture difference that's tricking me because my grips are a lot smoother, but it feels like these stick out more. And you'd think with this one being more worn down, this would feel like the one that sticks more inward, but I don't know. If it's talking about just a few millimeters, after you start playing this controller for a minute or two, you'll forget about that altogether. Now, one of the biggest positives of all with the PowerA controller is its D-pad. This thing feels amazing. It's almost like a Super Nintendo D-pad. It's just so responsive. I mean, it just feels good in your hands. Whereas the original GameCube controller, Look, even people who love the GameCube to death like me will admit that this is probably one of the worst and mushiest D-pads that Nintendo ever had. I mean, this just feels wrong. Especially over the years with this thing getting worn down. I have a Mega Man collection on GameCube, and if I try to use the D-pad on that, it gets me killed every time. I usually just use the stick because it can lock directions, and that's something I really miss. I love that it's got 360-degree movement just fine, but if you press harder, it locks into those grooves. That has actually come in handy way more than you'd think, even in modern games. And for any Breath of the Wild fans, you know the shrine where you have to do that pixel-perfect jump? It takes you like 300 tries? Yeah, I was trying that with the Joy-Cons and then the Pro Controller, and I just couldn't do it. Grabbed the GameCube controller, locked my direction, did it first time. So, it actually does have a very practical use. But that's not really a plus side of just the PowerA controller, that's just the GameCube controller in general. What I'm saying though is I wish that this would come back, because this is awesome. Now, back on subject of the D-pad, this thing feels so great. I've been using it non-stop for things like Sonic Mania, and it's a great time. This is one of the best D-pads I've ever used, and frankly, it's better than the Switch Pro Controller's D-pad. Not by a lot, because this is still a really good D-pad, but it's a little bit mushy compared to the PowerA controller, which just feels like old-school classic SNES Nintendo. And now, possibly the biggest selling point between whether you should get a GameCube controller or a Switch controller is which layout do you like more? They're both very similar. D-pads are in the same place, and the sticks. The button layout I much prefer on the GameCube because if you play a lot of different consoles and systems like me, a lot of them like to follow the Xbox button layout where A is on the bottom, B is on the side. Nintendo fans will know that just feels wrong, but you're gonna get yourself killed if you get used to one or the other in either game. Whereas this one, it doesn't solve that problem because you can remap the buttons or anything, though that would be nice, but I guess that's more up to the software than the controller. No, you can just feel the shape difference and size difference of each button, and you know for a fact that A is in the middle, Y is top, X is side, and B is kind of off on its own adventure over here. The last thing I can think of to compare are the C-sticks, and yeah, the C-stick feels a little bit worse on the PowerA controller than it does on an original GameCube controller. There's kind of like this soft plastic over it. I don't know what kind of plastic it would be, but it's a little bit squishy, very grippy. Whereas the PowerA controller, this is just solid plastic. There's none of that on there at all. It's not very grippy. However, the problem's kind of solved by the fact that it's the right shape for your thumb, and when you're pushing it in, that's the natural movement of your thumb. In, up, and down are fine. Pulling it back is where it should be slipping. However, interestingly enough, the indent of the letter C grips your thumb and prevents that from happening. No idea if that was intentional or not. I'm gonna guess that's just down to dumb luck because the shape of the letter C was never used for that in the original GameCube. It's sticky enough on its own. So, I'm just gonna say that PowerA caught a lucky break, and this could have been a bad design, but I don't have any problems with it personally. It feels pretty good. Even when I'm playing a shooter game where I have to use this constantly, it feels good. And the last thing, of course, that both the PowerA controller and the Nintendo Switch Pro controller do is they have built-in Bluetooth that can easily sync up to things like Steam and Windows 10, so you can use these controllers on your PC. Both of them do that just fine with no problem. So they're quite comparable, these two. Both of them get the job done just fine, and they're practically the same controller, just in different shells. Whereas the travel time is a little bit worse on the triggers on the PowerA controller compared to a Pro controller, which probably has the best travel time on triggers of pretty much any controller you can get for the Switch. I think I prefer the GameCube controller just because I like the button layout. I can feel which buttons are which. If you play a lot of different consoles or PC games like me and they change layouts all the time on you, this is a good way to keep it in your mind what you're doing. The D-pad, while both of them are perfectly fine, the PowerA controller really knocks it out of the water with the D-pad, and As for the sticks, both of them are fine. They're very grippy. They're comfortable. I would say that this one's a little bit more comfortable on your thumb than the PowerA controller, just because of how many rings there are. But it's not like it's gonna cause strain on either of these controllers to use it for prolonged periods of time. I just prefer the GameCube controller for the ridges. That's really all it comes down to. These ridges that don't get in the way unless you press down hard on them. I absolutely love these. It's so helpful, especially for those old school games. So, personal opinion, these things can run $80 to $85, maybe $75. They're starting to come down a little bit in price. The PowerA controller, I was able to pick up for $50, and I see them in Target and Walmart. They're restocked now over the holidays, where it was kind of hard to come by, but now they're everywhere. If you want to save a little bit of money, and you're more of an old school Nintendo player like I am, I'd definitely go with the PowerA controller. You get the same features, both of them are very comfortable controllers, and really it just comes down to the price and what your preferences are on the buttons. If for whatever reason you hate the button layout on the GameCube controller, the original one, you're not going to like the PowerA controller. It is very faithfully recreated, down to the Y button being slightly extended and curved towards your thumb to make it easier to press. I mean, they're almost identical, so this is really more of like the love child between the GameCube controller and the Switch Pro controller. But yeah, I would definitely highly recommend this. And if anyone's wondering, like I said, the plastic is a little bit different and the texture's different. If you're wondering what it feels like, because you can't really gauge that through a video, if you've ever used one of these classic controllers on the Wii, it's almost exactly the same material, particularly on the bottom where it's a little more rough. It feels very similar to that, and the build quality feels about the same, so not phenomenal, but very good. And the last question I can think of people having is what's the battery life on this thing, considering it takes AA's and can't be recharged, which I guess is a negative. It should be mentioned that the Pro controller is rechargeable and you don't have to swap the batteries on it, though that will deteriorate over time as every rechargeable controller does. This thing might last you longer in the long run. Plus you could just get rechargeable AA's. But as for the battery life on this thing, I cannot answer that question straight, because that entirely depends on the type of game that you're playing. Like I said, this thing has built-in motion controls, and it's got a million different uses for Switch games. It depends on how you're using it. I would say that it's definitely comparable to pretty much any standard controller with AA's. Like, say, the Xbox 360 controller. I'd say the battery life from what I've seen so far is ever so slightly better, though I'm sure if I was playing Splatoon non-stop, this thing would outlast the GameCube controller, but that's a matter of motion controls versus not using them. But that's pretty much all I can think of. If you guys have any more questions, I'll be sure to answer them in the comments section. And yeah, let me know what you think. Let me know if this was helpful to you, and which do you prefer? The GameCube controller or the Nintendo Switch Pro controller? But that's pretty much all I have to say for now. I hope you guys found this helpful, and let me know if you're considering on picking up one of these controllers, or if you own one and what you think of the controller. Let me know in the comments down below, and I'll see you guys all in the next one.